good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my precious pack, and welcome back once more to Vega Conflict. The synthesis event is underway. I've already collected everything I need, already built my first few ships, and blah 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 blah. Before I do anything, I want to test the effect against Pharmacon's phasing, and I'm going to use one of the two ships that I built already. And I'm going to throw it against a DDoS target just to see how the effect actually works. I don't care about throwing the ship away, because I mean, it's only a 3-hour, 37-minute repair time. I could fix that up over the course of the evening. But let's go ahead and let's go over to an attack target and let's take a look. The goal for this fight is simply to let the vessel die so that I can take a look at the value to see just what it means when it takes X number of damage over time and blah blah blah. And I'm going to complain about its overdrive a bit. I'm actually going to talk thoroughly about the ship as well as the weapon that came out with it. First off, I'm having a much more pleasant experience with its weapon on a destroyer than I am on the ship itself. Come on, pop up. Pop up and shotgun it. You know you want to. Alright. Okay, there at the end I saw that two of them were actually being affected with the damage over time stack thing, and it was taking longer to charge up. This is exactly what I thought was going to happen. First off, it's not going to counter the Pharmacon ships at all. It's going to roll over and die for them, more or less, because its overdrive wasn't well thought of, and I'm just going to put that blatantly out there. That's my opinion, and again, I don't think it's very well thought of. Let me explain why. Let's go ahead and let's go take a look at the other one's overdrive, and I'm going to more or less point this out very, very hilariously. First off, the ships have no resistance against plasma damage right off the bat, so they're weak against the targets you'd be expecting them to be decent against. Right off the bat, they have no resistance. You have to mark upgrade them, unlike every other Altairian ship that has a minimum of 40% by default. That gets increased to 50 at Mark 5. Well, it gets 50 at Mark 5 as well, but it gets nothing to begin with. Second, its feedback loop relies on it being damaged, and specifically the damage over time stacks. Now, I don't know what's wrong with the development team with this one, and this one's going to be a little bit critical. But first off, you wanted damage over time to be the weakest aspect against the Altairians because they use shields, and shields were supposed to help block the vast majority of the damage over time effects by blocking the damage itself. So this in itself, when I saw that the ship was the way that it was confusing, and in my eyes it seemed like a stupid, gross misuse of time. Because instead of actually applying the time to properly counter the Pharmacon with the Altairians, you built a ship that's effective use is to die. To negate the effect of the Pharmacon. And the reason I find this stupid, let's go ahead and let's hop over to the Fleet Commander section real quick. We have a new Fleet Commander coming out for the Pharmacon that increases the charge time. So the ship kind of seems useless in that aspect as well, because all you have to do is max out the commander, hitting 150 targets, and even a maxed out ship reducing the time it takes for you to charge by 50%. If you have this commander, it's going to effectively put that back up to what it was, or have it at twice what it would be normally, so when it's reduced, it's going to be the same as what it is normally, so you're back to square one, and you've accomplished nothing. Seems like a bit of a waste of time, right? Yeah. What else does your ship bring? Well, it apparently gives stasis and can strafe. And it's after it's got damage over time. It's not going to be able to catch anything because it's got no speed boosters or anything like that. And first off, a Pharmacon player in PvP isn't going to let you go anywhere near ships. Even I'm well aware of that, and I do the same thing. Whenever I'm using my battleships, I will sit as far away and I'll time it so that I fire one single volley and then go into phase, so when you fire, you get hit, take damage, but I go into phase and take no damage. So it's kind of irrelevant because the ship can't catch up to the vessel it's supposed to be shooting. Now, I'm not saying to nerf the Pharmacon, because you could also very, very, very heavily counter the Pharmacon using certain weapon types. And more specifically, if kicks out actually buff the Altairians to do what they're supposed to do and counter the Pharmacon. In the current state, this ship, I don't see it being worth building because the 30% charge hacking, it's still charging up. It's still charging, and it's after you get the new commander, it's going to effectively set you once again back to square one. Because you could do a low-level build and troll a bunch of people. Someone would come to stop you with the ship, and it would lose to them as well because of the commander. So again, this was mostly poorly thought out on my part, and it gains resistance through this, but the resistance is so mediocre, and without the actual resistance on the hull itself, it's going to struggle until you mark upgrade it. And again, we don't have mark upgrades right now, so target's still going to be difficult, and its charging ability, the Pharmacon charge hacking, it needs to be completely redone. First off, it shouldn't affect how long it takes for them to charge, because that's still allowing them to phase out, and most of the time all they're going to do is they're going to sit on the edge of your weapons range anyway, so you're not going to be able to close in. And they're going to stasis the ship to death. That's another problem. It has no stasis resistance. And it's just going to be stasis in oblivion, so you gave us a ship that has no practical use. Because I could kill it very, very easily with a Mark II Daemon or a Mark I Daemon, just by simply adding a single net torpedo on it. And you'd never be able to catch up. And you'd die because all I'd have to do is just fire a few volleys. And that's it. Oh, it'd take my shield a little bit longer, and it'd take me a little bit longer to go into phase. Well, all I have to do is time everything so you start taking the damage, you lose your shield and everything like that. And this is another thing that I love about how the Pharmacon is supposedly countered, but not. The Altairian shells, they have heavy plasma resistance. Only for their plasma shell. Every other shell is extremely weak, and so is their plasma shell. One thing you can do to completely counteract and negate the ability of the Altairian shells, because they're treated like a shield, and then the Altairian shields are essentially treated like a shield. It's simple. And what happens is they have increased damage taken, even though they have increased damage resistance against certain damage types, but the increased damage type is where they're at fault. You can not only destroy a single ship's shield in a single volley with a Daemon, you can heavily strip the shield of its health as well in that single shot, just because you can mix two damage types on the ships. The shields can't resist two damage types, and this is where another problem with the Pharmacon comes in. Altairians can't counter them because you can't block two damage types with the shields, and the shields are what you need to stop the damage over time. And if anyone tells you that the damage over time isn't all that dangerous, lose your shield against any of the targets, and you'll watch the damage over time stacks rapidly go up, and you'll see the damage every single tick start to stack up, and you may not think anything of like 1,000 damage, because you're going to have about 50 or 60% resistance to it, but the longer it's allowed to stay on your ship, the more damage you're taking. The more damage you're taking, the less health you have left, and you can be killed in a matter of 2-3 volleys from a battleship. That's it. All it takes, just 2 or 3. And this Battlecruiser, it is the weakest excuse that I've seen it a counter this entire time. So the ship itself, I don't really see it as being useful or obtaining it. I would rather pick up the actual Bastion, because its overdrive, it truly can counter, because the damage increase. Okay, now that I've whined enough about that, let's go ahead and let's take a moment to talk about what can be done to the Altairians to be able to effectively counter without having to nerf the current state of the Pharmacon. In turn, more or less making it so that the player base will complain that, oh hey, you nerfed the stuff we built, we're not playing anymore. Let's take a look at them. Let's take a look at every single one of the Tier 3 ships. Well, I mean Tier 7. But let's take a look at the battlecruisers and cruisers in specific. Let's start with the Wraith. What's the Wraith bringing to the fight under its modifiers? It gets shield bypass. It gets increased Altairian damage. Alright, shield bypass, because the Altairian shield can be bypassed, and it should be bypassed, only by the Pharmacon. Nothing else should be allowed to bypass it. It should be treated as the screens are treated and then how ablative is treated. That way, the Pharmacon cannot bypass it, and it needs to be reworked. Let's take a look at the Bastion in comparison to the Wraith and compare what they have going for them. Absolutely nothing. Increased damage, that doesn't do anything because you can't hit your target, because it just phases out. Same with the Battleship, you can't hit it if it phases out. And one change that I would suggest making to every single Altairian ship to allow them to effectively counter, or more effectively counter, the Pharmacon, give them 25% increased damage versus screens, regardless of the type. And that's for every single ship. Every single one of them should have increased damage, because every single one of the Umbra, they have shield bypass or shield damage or something that does something to shields, because they were meant to counter the Altairians, and they did. Now Altairians, their time came around and they can't do anything. And it's because when you do hit the target, it doesn't really do that much. Second, you never know what type of shell they're going to have, and most of the time, they're most likely from now on, they're going to have Deflector on, because one of the few things that could touch them was the long-range projectile weapons, kinetic weapons. And with the introduction of this new shell type, that's going to be in a even less effective strategy, because they're going to have 65% off the damage, and you're losing and only doing 10% bypass damage. So every single vessel, again, I would recommend giving them a 25% increase versus any and all Pharmacon screens. And that is for every single ship. And just like with the Umbra, as its mark upgrade, I think it should be upgraded by 5% per level, up to 50% damage against screens. Effectively countering a screen, because a single shot will be doing 50% more damage to the target screen, stripping them of just that much more easily, effectively reducing one little aspect. Second, the Altairians need a new weapon system or something to allow them to hit phased targets, because as long as they're not able to hit the target, or their last shot they fired hits where the target was at, and the target may still be sitting there or near it, they're not doing any damage. They can't counter what they can't hit. Now, this is where you can at least go into a lore-specific aspect or some nonsense like that. You can talk about how the Altairians' cores of the newer vessels all have some unique harmonic energy or some void energy or something that allows the rounds that are fired from Altairian vessels to effectively phase. So the last shot fired by the Altairian vessel before a target phases can impact and do phase damage, effectively forcing the vessel that it impacted back out of phase. Now, not in the way that you think by actually forcing it back out, but by reducing the phase health, the screen health, stuff like that. Those types of things, those would help the Altairians be a hard counter to the Pharmacon. Right now they roll over and they just die. So that's two recommendations, and I have a third one as well. The other one, increase or buff every single one of the Altairian ships to have a soft range increase, so that they just can't be outranged anymore, so that they are going to be the dominant ranged force or anything like that. Or alternatively, take a good look at their overdrives and rework each and every overdrive. Let's take a look at the Firestorm. And this is where the third change would come into effect, and it would mainly affect overdrives if this is the following case. Firestorm overdrive, damage per second boost, 300%, extremely good. 20% increased range, it's okay, but it's not the 40% it was to begin with, and it never will be, but changing to 25% would allow most targets to be hit again. Second, shield bypass. It doesn't need shield bypass, so do away with the shield bypass, give it increased damage versus screens, or give it screen bypass, so it's completely ignoring it because for some reason, when the overcharge activates, because the energy of the shell reverberates back into the core of the ship, it somehow causes a catalyst, which more or less activates a hidden feature or a varying weapon effect. I would say go with increased screen damage though, because again, if you're just bypassing the screen, you're damaging the ship under it, but you're still leaving the ship intact, and it can still phase because you're not doing as much damage. The Altairians need to be able to dish out an extremely large amount of damage to screens. And at that point, if they're capable of hitting the targets while they're phased and stripping them of their phased abilities, as well as their ability to use the screens or anything like that, if they're capable of stripping it off extremely quickly, then they would be the counter they're supposed to be. But again, in the current state, they roll over and they die extremely quickly to them. And this sad excuse of a ship isn't a counter to them. Just making them take longer to charge up isn't a counter. It's a very, very weak excuse. It's saying that it is, because the problem isn't that they're phasing. It's that while they're phased, you can't damage them. If the Altairians can't damage them while they're taking damage, how are they supposed to counter them? Again, consider what I've said. Consider altering each Altairian ship to have increased screen damage and a passive ability that allows their last shot fired at a target to damage the ship and actually do damage to the screen. Even if you change it so it only does damage to the screen. So, the ship will have 100% protection while it's phased, but its screen will be damaged instead. Just do something to actually allow them to counter them. Because I watched Paragon fleets and Inquisitor fleets lose to damage just because you can't touch them, or in the case of the Inquisitor, most of its weapons miss, or the person times it correctly so they get to fire at your Inquisitor from the edge of its firing arc because of the insane movement speed while you're in phase, and you in turn get to do no damage in return. Okay, that part of the rant is over. Now on to the saving grace that I actually have come to love. I actually enjoy using the new weapon. The Prime Vulcan, it looks mediocre, and the greatest comparison is actually to a weapon 2 tiers below. That's right, you heard that correctly. Its greatest comparison is to this. Its greatest comparison can be to the Eclipse Driver. It travels faster, it can pierce, and the projectiles, they end at the 5,000 meters. They don't go any further. But they have such a high fire. You know what? I'm just going to show you the high fire rate. You already saw it with the initial attack against the target, but I'm going to show you it again from a destroyer's perspective. So, pull that guy out. I have a destroyer prepared because I was playing with it earlier. And I'm going to go ahead and find an in-planet target. Actually, no, I'm going to find an out-planet target, and I'm going to attack it. I'm going to show you what I mean. Now, check this rate of fire out. First off, long-range weapon, 5,000 meters base range for its maximum, 3,000 for its minimum. That means that you have to be careful, but as you're going to see, its rate of fire more than makes up for that. So the damage per second isn't a matter of it hits once and it stops. It hits like this. That is exceptional. The rate of fire on this more than makes up for the utter failure of a ship that I saw. That was the Vulcan, the Prime Vulcan. That rate of fire is just exceptional. And as I'm going to refer to it, it's going to be the Eclipse Driver 2.0. Second, we need to add a little bit more detail and stuff behind what I was recommending earlier for the changes to the Altairians. Again, I think that they should be given an increased damage against the screens because right now the number of shots that impact are very low due to the amount of time that the amount of time that it takes for the target to go into phase again is more or less counteracting it, because you may fire, but the travel time will allow them to go into phase again before your shots impact. And this is where the passive trait that I mentioned would come in. It would more or less counter them by allowing you to do damage to them with the last volley fired. You know, they'd still be untargetable and stuff like that while they're in phase, but the last shot fired would just rip their screens apart. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't be this current state where you have to be afraid of the Pharmacon because they can pop up anywhere due to their high movement speed, and you have to be afraid of them just because you can't increase or bypass their shields. Well, in this case, we don't want to bypass their screen. We want to strip the screen off of them in a very, very, very high damage, very, very high octane fight. You just want to literally strip it off and take away that ability to phase. So, consider those following changes. Go ahead and discuss them, but I'm going to go through the synthesis prize list, and there was 2 prizes I can recommend. The first one, for all the classes, all the factions, well, the tier 7, the Vulcan. It is extremely good. Again, it is the Eclipse Driver 2.0. And the screen, the deflector screen for the Pharmacon, because this will allow you to begin countering this weapon as well. So again, 2-stage weapon, blah blah blah. You're going to have the 65% reduced, or another way that the Altairians could counter the Pharmacon is giving certain ships a certain ability, aside from the damage through phasing, that actually does increase damage or applies a reset, kind of, so it resets this phase screen charge, encouraging people to play a little bit more safely, because at the beginning of the Pharmacon season, I do distinctively remember them saying that they were fragile ships that relied on the phase. Well, they're not fragile, not even by a long shot. They are tanks if you've ever seen them. And allowing Altairians to have an ability like that, there's multiple ways you could pursue it. See, I mentioned earlier they could do damage in phase. Well, they don't have to. If they can catch them, they should be allowed to reset their screen. They could do any number of things, but each one, just consider them. Talk about them below. Recommend some changes to kick sign, see which one they like the best. But those are just what I like. And those are the only 2 recommendations, the Vulcan and the deflector screen. I don't recommend getting the ship in its current state because it's not strong enough to counter the Pharmacon, because all it does is it reduces the charge time after it reaches a certain damage over time value, and with no base plasma resistance, it makes it extremely fragile against something that should supposedly counter. And with that, I can say that that's it for this video, everybody. If you liked the video, if you have anything to say, if you have anything to add, if you want to discuss anything, feel free to say so below in the comment section. If you have any recommendations or anything I may not have mentioned that could be viable to actually allow the Altairians to counter the Pharmacon, consider making sure that it won't make them more powerful against the Umbra, because Umbra should counter them as they do now, but only more powerful against the Pharmacon. If you want to see more content like this, leave a like on the video so I know that you guys like this content. If you guys want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe. There's more videos like this on the channel. And something I do want to do, this is something I stopped doing a while ago, hit or miss. This time I'm going to do the hit or miss for the new ship as well as the weapons and the screens. Weapon is a hit because I like it. The screen is a hit just because it's a new screen. It's a new type of defense that we can use depending on situations that we may want. The new ship, it's a miss by miles, because I've already hated on it enough and pointed out that it's not a hard counter. None of the Altairian ships are, and until some buffs happen to them to counter, they're all going to be weak. The overall event, well, I played for about an hour and I had everything I wanted. Built the ships, everything like that. And with that, I can say, that's it, everybody. Be safe out there in the void, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.